My name is Sandy Ross, and I'm the Executive Director of Family Court Awareness Month. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and our mission is to raise awareness and shine a spotlight on one of the most important branches of our judicial system, the family court system. Our critical conversations include seasoned experts and brave survivors. The goal is to not only shine the spotlight on serious systemic related issues, but by the nature of conversation, it is our hope that ideas and solutions will come forward to help move us toward a safer family court system. We would like to thank the Genesee Center, our partner for this session. The Genesee Center is a nationally recognized nonprofit who has been offering life-saving domestic violence services for more than 40 years. The Genesee Center works locally, nationally, and globally to shine a light on violence against women, girls, men, and boys. They advocate for the basic human right for all people to have peace in their homes and relationships. Their website is genesee.org, and that's Jenesee. Today's conversation is called Black Women in Family Court Cases. We have a panel of 4 brilliant Black mothers who, through their lived experiences, will shine a light on the most pressing issues for Black women in the court system. Our moderator for the conversation is Roman James. Roman, if you can join me on the screen. Thank you. I'm so glad that you're here today. Roman is more than just a protective mother and survivor. She is a co-founder of the International Coercive Control Conference, the world's leading annual symposium on coercive control. As a family court activist, published writer, and public speaker, Roman has led discussions to address systemic violence against survivors within the legal system and its failure to serve the needs of women and children. Roman is an abolitionist of our family court, child protective services, and the current state of domestic violence advocacy. She has long believed that the system is not broken, but working just as it was designed. Roman, we greatly appreciate your tireless advocacy, and especially for you leading this conversation today. And with that, I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sandy, for engaging me as the moderator and committing to having this much needed conversation with this esteemed panel of Black moms who bring very divergent experiences within the family court crisis to this conversation. Before I introduce them, I would like to thank the founder of Family Court Awareness Month, Tina Swithin, and all of the other organizers, including you, Sandy, for curating this month's series of conversations with stakeholders from all over the country who are truly vested in progressive efforts to reform family court, prioritize child safety, and educate about harmful practices like reunification camps and parental alienation claims. My personal credo is that awareness plus education equals liberation. And with that said, I would like to get started. I am extremely honored to introduce this amazing group of women that we have assembled for today's panel. To begin, Tiffany Drayton is a mother, world traveler, and journalist whose work has been featured in the New York Times, Vox, Marie Claire, Playboy, Salon, Complex, and Yahoo, among many other outlets. She is the author of Black American Refugee, Escaping the Narcissism of the American Dream, and has published 2 nonfiction young adult books, Developing Political Leadership Skills and Coping with Gun Violence. While she grew up in the United States, she currently resides in Tobago, the locale that is central to her Hague Convention case. Welcome, Tiffany. Protective mom, Susan Spell, MD, is an internationally acclaimed health and beauty expert. As a Harvard and NYU trained director of dermatology with a background in internal medicine dermatology, Dr. Spell treats a roster of celebrity clientele at her Beverly Hills practice and is a top healthy skin expert for both Oprah and Dr. Oz. In March 2018, Los Angeles County awarded Dr. Spell a $150,000 settlement after a problematic social worker lied under oath and falsified evidence to remove her 4 children from her custody amid a complex and turbulent custody battle. I want to thank you, Dr. Spell, for joining us today. Next, I am pleased to welcome Elizabeth Stewart Williams, MDR, or Master of Dispute Resolution. Elizabeth is the founder of Liz Yvonne Dispute Resolution Services, LLC, a conflict resolution firm that assists women and families in settling disputes in underserved communities. Galvanized by her own experiences within the family court, this protective mom founded I Am Pro Se, an organization dedicated to servicing Black survivors of domestic abuse. This graduate of the Pepperdine Caruso School of Law is now pursuing her PhD at Nova Southeastern University. Elizabeth, let me be the first to thank you for taking time away from your coursework to join us in this long overdue conversation. And finally, I want to introduce Latia Settle, protective mother, advocate, and veteran of the U.S. Army who served as a chief warrant officer. Currently, she serves her community as a certified peer support specialist, assisting individuals in regaining control over their lives during the recovery process. She also advocates for women veterans and their children trapped in the family court and juvenile dependency court crisis. As a result of her efforts, Latia is the recipient of the 2021 Betty Fisher Award, a prestigious honor bestowed on awardees that demonstrate outstanding commitment and dedication to the field of domestic violence, prevention, and intervention. Lastly, she achieved quite a feat by lobbying for the passage of SB 1182, a bill she authored to ensure recognition of military veteran status in family court. Governor Gavin Newsom signed it into law on September 17, 2022. Kudos to you, Latia, and welcome. So before we start the conversation, I want to address that today's topical nature is one that could be triggering for the survivors viewing this discussion. If at any time you are feeling overwhelmed by the discussion, please prioritize your mental health by either muting the audio or leaving the discussion altogether. This recording will be available afterwards to view at a later date and to watch per your discretion. All right, so to get started, I want to first delve into the gender issue. It was established in 1990 through a US Department of Justice, Office of Justice Programs report that overwhelming evidence existed of pervasive gender bias in the courts against women litigants, lawyers, and even court personnel. And it is readily apparent through the court's disposition of divorce, custody, child support and domestic violence, rape, prostitution, and even the award of damages. So as a demographic, upon entry into this ostensible barrier to being a mother to your child, in a system that is really designed to make you keep your family together, do you all believe that your gender has factored into your custody outcomes? And anyone can start.
Well, again, I can get to race next, but as far as gender is concerned, yes. And I say that because in my family court experience, I'm a physician, and my ex-husband was a physician too, with a restraining order and documented physical abuse to myself and 2 of my children. And since everything else was equal except for our gender, it definitely played a part. I could see the male to male camaraderie in the courtroom, and it's very easy to say, oh, she's crazy, because that's like their go-to, right? That she's crazy, she's emotional, she's a female. And it definitely played a part in my court case, unfortunately.
Tiffany, if you want to answer next.
Yeah, I would definitely like to second that. We kind of spoke briefly before about the impact of being in a court case against a Black man as a Black woman, because, walking into that situation, there are all of these biases that people don't really think about. And a lot of the bias around men, for example, and Black men, is that they don't want to take care of their kids and they don't want to be there and be participants. And so for me, I ended up experiencing this desire on the part of especially female judges, the first female judge who took jurisdiction of my case a year after I actually relocated to Trinidad and Tobago, was kind of playing into this narrative that this man wants to be a part of his children's lives. Why are you trying to take the kids away? And I was like, wait a minute, firstly, aren't there laws to govern this? And secondarily, like, it's not supposed to be about him. It's supposed to be about the best interest of the children. So we see that the biases that people have about men can either really actually works for men who want to use the court system to control women, because the court system wants men to participate. So it's a very strange dynamic walking into it, not knowing initially how that all worked.
Elizabeth, would you like to comment?
Yeah, and if I can just add, I'm actually going to go even more, a little bit deeper historical. So to me, we cannot even, for Black women, there's a conjunction there. Like, we can't really separate that, especially in this family court system, because the system for us initially started on an auction block, right? Family court for us began there historically for our families. And so it was never intended for Black women to keep their children. It was never intended for families to stay together. There's a separation that is expected. So here, the way that it has been structured, or this system has been structured, it's not an expectation for a Black woman to keep. A Black woman is really at the mercy of whoever wants to do whatever to her. So that decision is just based off of those who are in charge of the system. So a lot of times it's shocking because we've worked so hard for our rights and to be recognized. But when a system is that corrupt, that's kind of the expectation. Like, and then how dare you fight? This is what, how dare you push back on that, and that's the Black woman. And then if we just look at the woman, family court was structured for man. A woman was property, and then you compound that with Blackness. How dare you? So definitely the struggle is, you would think we've come this far, but really, we're literally fighting what has been ebbed into that structure. So.
Well, I think that, emphasizes the intersectional value, right? The first sort of priority has been on women, because if you remove race, ethnicity, language barriers, even possibility of religion, what is left over is sort of the first political order, which is gender. And so that leads me to a quote from Indiana State Representative Vanessa Summers, who is the ranking minority member, meaning she's a Democrat, so her party is in the minority in Indiana. She is the ranking member on the Family, Children, and Human Affairs Committee. And she once said, it's exhausting being a woman, but it's really exhausting being a Black woman. And that quote, while not directly related, addresses the intersectionality of Black mothers' plight within the legal system. And what you said, Elizabeth, reminds me that I always emphasize that we should know the origins of things, because often either the origins were convoluted or compromised over time, or we've lost the origin story of the institution or the dynamic during, the years that it's been in existence. And so I wanted to ask you, Liz, how does that correlate with your personal experience within the family court? Because you are a legal professional who's trained as a family court ombudsman. So how are you able to parse that through your lens as a legal professional?
So as an ombudsman, it's a neutral type position. What that means is, I'm not, and I proudly say this, I'm not so much trained to follow the system. I'm trained to identify the issues within the system and bring those issues to light. I'm trained to hear the struggles of what people are going through and then be able to bring that to light, which means I'm not liked within their own profession. And I proudly wear that, right? So the power in that is to see all of the different problems and issues that are present. The power in that is that I have no homage to hold on to principles or actions or procedures that are discriminatory or biased or, or period that would hurt humanity, right? I'm so neutral in the sense of, look, this is hurting someone or these are hurting people, it has to change. And a lot of times people don't want that. A lot of times you want to stay within the system and you want, this is how we should go along and this is how we should operate. And, maybe the one thing they always come out with is maybe they don't understand. And then I'm like, no, they understand because I'm trained. So I understand and I know that it's wrong. And so there's no hiding behind, the veil of law. No, this is an issue that's in the forefront and address it, So I think that's how it's balanced. I still struggle. A lot of times I'll hear people say, because I'm not an attorney, a lot of times they're just like, oh, be one. But my struggle a lot of times with that is then I would have to adhere to that whole structure. And my goal is to reveal it. I want the world to see it. And then we need to change it. It's not about staying where it is or how it was set up to create. No, it needs to be a change so that we can stop the abuses of our children. We can stop the abuses with ourselves. We can just stop the abuse. We can eradicate domestic violence. We can eradicate domestic abuse, and we can begin to really build the way that we're supposed to build as a people, period. So.
Latia, I want to, before you step in, Susan, I wanted to ask Latia, because I've known Latia to be a social justice activist for at least the last 5 years, and she's really fought to engender change within LA County. And so I would like to hear from her about the impact that she feels she's had on the system, the incremental changes that have come about as a result of her fighting for, her son, her child, and all of the efforts that she's made that have been extended to, because of her fight, have been extended to others.
Well, I think one of the changes is just bringing attention to family court, period, because I know in like the veteran community, a lot of the services that are provided, they were just focused on the criminal portion and criminal courts and the veteran treatment court. And the only way you can get help in the Veterans Treatment Court is if you have a criminal charge, in addition to having a substance abuse issue or a mental health challenge. And if you don't have any of that, then there was no assistance. I guess they felt like if you were any type of court system, there had to be a criminal charge. And it just took me a long time to get them to understand that in the family court, there didn't have to be a criminal charge. You can have your child taken from you without a criminal charge. And that just took a long time for those in the veteran and military affairs arena to understand that. So I think now they understand that, and they're looking more into what's happening in the family court system.
Susan, did you want to?
Yeah, just before we, since you initially started with the gender and we're talking about really making a change, there was a time when women actually had an advantage in family court. Up until somewhere in the late 70s, maybe early 80s, there was the tender year doctrine. And what that was designed to do was to protect children. And so irrespective of whatever the circumstances, until age 12, children, or 12 or 14, children were not the subject of a court custody battle. So there was no going into a therapist, there was no anything, you just automatically went with your mom. It was the tender year doctrine. It's like not to be determined in court. The children go to the mother. And at that point, we had an advantage. Then the men's rights groups kind of lobbied, and they claimed it was sexual discrimination, which I'm not sure how they got that through, because in order for it to be discrimination, you have to be a party that is underserved or underrepresented, or that you suffered something. And men are not that. They're not a class that should get a discrimination clause, but they got it through. And that's what opened it up to joint custody and determining where you should go. And that's when the women, we lost our footing. I also wish I would have been around at that time, because if they said it's sexual discrimination that the kids go with the mother, then I would say, well, okay, then I want a law that the men have to actually carry the baby. Okay, I want them to actually have to go through labor. I want them to have to nurse, get stretch marks, gain weight, and actually have oxytocin released in your brain to make you bonded with the child, that, it's completely makes you fall apart not to have your child with you. I mean, the inherently to being a human, the women do put in more labor. And I don't think it's discrimination to say that the child should go with the mother, because all of us here today would not have a problem if the tender year doctrine were still in place, and all of our children would not have been subjected to what they've been subjected to if it were in place. And along the lines of making a change, I would, advocate bringing it back, because we've had changes now at the Supreme Court with Roe versus Wade. Women, we can't make these decisions when it comes to our bodies. So if you're going to make us stick with it, then we should be able to get some of our other things to go back. It's just an idea, but it's something. At that point, family court was not as bad. And I would love to see it come back.
Well, it's suspected or hypothesized that everything started changing once women got the right to divorce through no-fault divorces. So we're looking at a possibility of 40 years. It was, just 50 years ago that women couldn't even have credit cards in their own names. They were not allowed to sign for loans without their husband or their father. So once women started gaining more freedoms, incrementally, men started pulling back. And that's why I think, for everyone who's attending today, it's so important to know the origins of how things transition, because people tend to accept things as the status quo, and that's just how it always was. But even with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, we have to understand that first of all, abortion has been going on, or, what they call recovering their menses, since the beginning of time. So the idea that Roe v. Wade or abortion is the provenance of the Christian right, that didn't start until the late 1800s. And part of that issue came from the fact that Black women overrepresented midwives by 80% in this country. And the white male physicians field determined that they wanted to take that away from Black women. They wanted to medicalize maternity and make it so that they could monetize that process. So when we don't understand our history, things tend to get lost. And I think if we, as we continue to have these conversations, these things will come out, because I think more than anything, there's just a overall ignorance of what has happened over the history. And so building on that, racism is born of the same patriarchal desire to dominate that sexism originated from. So under that construct, it is no surprise that a legal system that incarcerates Black Americans at a disproportionate rate to their representation in the population also takes Black children through either child dependency or child welfare or the family court system. And to give further context, I just wanted to give a statistic that's related to Black survivors because it's all connected. And for the sake of this conversation, when I speak of survivors, I'm specifically speaking of women. We understand that men and Black men can be survivors of domestic abuse as well. But for this conversation, I'm speaking of Black women. So according to the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, nationally, 41% of Black women have experienced intimate partner physical violence, sexual violence, and or partner stalking in their lifetime. That is 10 percentage points lower than white women's rates of those experiences. So when people ask, well, what's the difference between Black women's experience, Black mothers' experience, or even, other women of color and white women, I would like to have us delve into that and go to the granular level. And, please don't share anything that you're not comfortable with, but I would love for you guys to give examples because you all have very different cases. Your entry point into this crisis was from different positions. So whoever would like to start by sharing their experience as a Black mother in the system.
Well, I'll jump right in, just because I think there's something unique to my case. I left my ex-husband because of physical violence the time he had broken my wrist, and I was trying to defend my daughter, who kicked him because he was being violent with me and he was going for her. And that was the last straw. And however, while in the case, even though I did get a restraining order, a 3-year restraining order protecting myself from him, he ended up being awarded custody. And the reason why, we did a 730 evaluation, and even though he was aware of the fact that he got violent with me, he had hit the children with the belt, bruised them, and they reported fear of him for his violence. The 730 evaluator, a psychological evaluator, came to the assessment with some study that said African-American children, well, they just said essentially all children are harmed. It's detrimental for them to be physically hit or corporal punishment. It affects them negatively, emotionally, and from all aspects. However, they cited a study that Black children, their behavior responds if you hit them physically. And based on that, even though they're aware of my ex's violence, they awarded him custody and essentially chastised me or punished me because I complained about it and put me on supervised visits. And they recommended taking the kids away from me 100% and just putting me on supervised, actually 6 weeks without me seeing them at all. And then I was on supervised visits. So there's something that's very concrete. As a Black woman, I was punished for complaining about physical violence.
Well, that's an expectation, right? It's a holdover from slavery. There are all of these ways that generational trauma going back to African-American enslavement in this country shows up in modern times. And the concept that Black children respond better to corporal punishment is a holdover from slavery.
Most definitely. And even the fact that if it's detrimental to other races, but obviously this is how we, Black people treat themselves, or they treat their children violently. And that's a holdover from slavery. And, it's racial discrimination. We couldn't believe it was in black and white that they actually said, with the exception of Black children, they do better if they're actually hit. And I happen to have been with a judge who also gave a restraining order to a white woman who was actually like Ashkenazi Jewish. And her restraining order was for the fact that her husband, not even her husband, but the sperm donor to her child, made a comment to her father that he wanted the children to be Christian. And that upset her. It disturbed her peace. And because it disturbed her peace, she got a 3-year restraining order and full custody of her child. And it could, which I think perhaps was right. But I, on the other hand, had a restraining order because he broke my wrist and it was physical harm. And I couldn't even get protection for my children. So it shows you a disparity right there in race and what we're supposed to take, and how white women, on the other hand, they're protected from it.
Yeah,
Well,
and
we're also not perceived as perfect victims, right? We come in with that implicit bias of the strong Black woman trope, that Black women can be the aggressors. Black women tend to be loud. They assert themselves in ways that we don't see in victims. We don't look like the victims. We don't present like the victims. So you're already coming into the legal system with that barrier to overcome. No matter your education, no matter your income level, no matter how well you present or how articulate or educated you are, you're already up against that mindset or that ideology. Tiffany, you want to comment?
Yeah, brief background. So I relocated to Trinidad and Tobago, as I said before, with the father of my 2 kids. And we had an altercation. And so as a result, I remained there, and he moved back to Jersey and claimed he was coming to stay. And then a year later decided to start a court custody case because during one of his visits, there was a physical altercation, and I called the police and said he could no longer stay in the home. So a year later, that's when the court case started. So it's really it has been so disturbing to me as a Black woman to watch it all unfold, because not only has there always been the understanding that there has been abuse involved, but it now 3 years into the litigation, most recently this summer, his wife actually wrote an affidavit on my behalf. I apologize for the noise in the background. I'm gonna let it pass. So his wife wrote an affidavit on my behalf, letting the judge know that my ex was abusing the children, that he was smoking marijuana, all of these things. And I thought at that point, okay, they're finally going to believe that this man is abusive. And at that point, they actually turned, a day later, I apologize. So a day later, I went to pick up my kids for our supervised visits. I had supervised visits at that time. And I rang the doorbell, and my children opened the door and told me no one was home. And so as a result of this, on top of the affidavit that I had submitted and that his then wife had submitted, I thought certainly by this point, the court system would believe me, that the judges would believe me. And I did not return my children after their supervised visits because I was literally scared for their well-being. something that I had been reporting over and over again, the abuse, the neglect of the children, etc. And as a result of not returning my children when I went to go pick them up and they answered the door and I walked through the home and saw no one, as a result of me refusing to return them, they have literally stripped me of my rights to my children, who I have not seen now since July. And every single court hearing, there is a new reason why this man does not have to move forward with the custody evaluation that was court ordered years ago that he refuses to pay for, refuses to participate in. There's always a whole host of reasons why he is not held accountable, but the kind of standards I'm held to are so absurd. And that's what it is to be a woman and a Black woman in the court system, is what I'm understanding now.
Latia, I know your story, and Elizabeth, I think you were getting ready to comment, but I wanted to insert another statistic that according to the CDC, Black women experience the highest rates of violence. And as a result of us leading that statistic, our rates of homicide are 4.4 per 100,000, and that's more than double that of white women. So if we look at the fact that Black women and girls are killed overwhelmingly, like 3/4 of Black women and girls who are murdered are killed by guns, what are our options for protecting our children? And I know, Latia, you have specifically addressed the issue of child welfare, the child welfare to prison pipeline. And I wanted to have you comment on your efforts to protect your child, because I know your circumstances and what you have faced in trying to protect your child.
Yeah, it has been really complex, like, kind of like what Dr. Susan was saying, like I had a protective order as well. And when I spoke up about it, when the judge was trying to ignore it, I then was punished. I was punished for, following my military order, like that whole thing was ignored. It's a long story, but when the table was flipped on me, I was too put on supervised visitations. And then the father insisted that we do monitored visitations inside of a police station, inside of an interrogation room. And there was just a whole lot of stuff going on there, a lot of abusiveness going on there at the police station. I didn't feel safe at the police station. They weren't paying attention to a lot of the things that were going on. When I would bring issues to their attention, they weren't paying attention to it. So I had to put paperwork to the court to request to move away from the police station, because I didn't even feel safe there because of the way it was set up and nobody was paying attention. And maybe a few weeks or a month later, another mother was killed outside of that same police station, because they're not paying attention to what's going on and they could care less. It's just like they blow it off, and it's like, go tell the judge when you go back to court. So I felt more safe at a plaza where there was more people moving around, more cameras, because the police station was in an isolated area and they're just back behind their desk, not doing anything. There was nobody outside to, monitor what was going on. So it's kind of sad that that's what I felt I had to do to protect me and my child, was to get away from the police station, to be around more people, to have eyes on us when we were doing our exchange. So just things like that.
I remember that case. That case occurred in Hawthorne,
Right.
At the sheriff's department. And in that particular instance, the mother was there. It was a Latina woman, and she was there to exchange her child. The father had arrived, set the child inside of the police station, walked out to his truck, got his shotgun, and as the mother was walking in, she left her vehicle, which had her family members, to go get the child. He shot her in the back.
Mm-hmm.
And this is at the police station.
Right.
And as a result of that happening and the spotlight being on that particular sheriff's department station, the first thing they did was blame the victim and said that we usually don't know about these types of things, when I know full well that many times mothers who are seeking protection through exchanges at the police station often go into the police station and let them know and provide them, the custody order or the information. And so, immediately to deflect, their responsibility in letting this woman be murdered outside their doorstep, they immediately deflected and blamed her. I want to go to Elizabeth. I think you have some interesting experiences to share, because I know your story as well.
So yeah, I'm gonna try to move forward, because we would all have to have tea and popcorn from my story. But so basically I got custody of my kids. And then my ex worked really hard to befriend as many cops, as many judges, attorneys as he could possibly do. Finally got our court case in front of a judge. I literally walked into the courtroom. I am the darkest, beautiful melanin thing there. And I was told before I even opened my mouth that he didn't like me, right? On record. And so I'm looking around like, what is this? I had evidence, and you have to understand my background. So my background, I was a paralegal for over 12 years at that time. So I had worked in every area of law. Not only was I a paralegal, but I was also a trained conservatorship legal worker for the state of Texas. I would do work with CPS, Adult Protective Services. I also worked and was trained as a paralegal underneath the federal government antitrust division. I pretty much worked in every area of law. At the time, I was trying to figure out, what area I wanted to go into. So the only area I had not worked in was family court. And I literally walk in, and so my background in understanding civil procedure, I know this is a standard across the board in dealing in any courtroom. And so when he looked at me, he was like, I don't like you. I'm like, oh, you can't do this. Like, who does this? Like, where, and I'm in shock. I'm looking over at my attorney, and my attorney's like, does he know you? I'm like, no, like, what in the world? We didn't have a hearing. He literally just made a ruling without looking at any evidence, anything. And I was like, what? Like, what is happening, right? So then I began to look at other cases in the court, and I'm like, a lot of other cases, they're being lied to. Mothers are being lied to, like, attorneys are just saying things, and I'm like, no, that's not according to procedure. So I just began to say that's not true. According to civil procedure here, you can appeal. And so they ended up giving my kids back to their father. Within 2 weeks, he had another CPS case. Then he gave me my kids back. I found that my attorney was scared, like really scary. So I was like, okay, I got to find another attorney. Got another attorney, spent another, $7,000 trying to get another attorney, only for this attorney to tell me that this is a father's rights county and you're not going to get your kids. You just need to give him custody. And I'm like, what? Again, like the shock was amazing to me. And I was like, how in the world? No, I need you to file this, and this, and I'll draft the documents yourself. Like, you don't have to worry about it. And he literally told me, you know too much, I have to get off your case. And the next thing that they did was, when they realized that I knew I'm a paralegal, I can respond to you all day until I find the attorney that I need. So they saw that I would respond. So a lot of attorneys, what they'll do is they will flood the courts with a bunch of motions. Every motion is money. Every phone call is money. So what they do is they run your bill up really high. And then if you don't know how to respond or what to do or how to guide your attorney, what ends up happening is your bill is so high you can't afford to keep your attorney. So as soon as you let go of your attorney, they keep filing. and then you lose you lose custody or you lose access on default judgments. But they saw that they couldn't do that with me. I mean, I was on it up until one court hearing. They decided that they would verify me what day. And by this time, I've gone to almost 7 to 10 court hearings within a 3-month time frame, right? Mm-hmm. So who can keep a job like that? No one. Who can continue to maintain that? Like no one. And so they found out the day that I couldn't make it, drafted up an order, walked it into another judge that had nothing to do with our case, had the case signed according to that order, used the date that I couldn't be in attendance to court as our trial date. And they closed my court hearing, giving full custody and everything that I had from my initial divorce, giving it to my ex. And so I'm like, well, who does that? So of course I file and I sue everyone because they blocked me out of filing. They blocked me out of doing anything within the court. And it was just, I was in pure shock. They refused any mail that I sent, they refused it. Anything that I provided, they refused it. So I filed court cases, not only through the state of Texas, it got all the way up to the Supreme Court. I did this pro se. I also filed in federal court. The issue that came about is family court is not a court of law. Family court is a court of discretion. So I was forced in federal court to go back to state court because it's not federally technically recognized. And
that's
so
interesting. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, I don't mean to interrupt you, because what you're saying about your case, Susan also had a case in federal court, and I want to examine the difference because she was able to get her case heard through federal court. Susan, can you comment on your case?
Sure, I will. And what she's saying is still true. We were able to get in under the narrow reason that I had a warrantless removal of my children. So the child services removed my children without a warrant. And that's one of the narrow things that you can take to federal court. And it has to be against an agency for that specific thing. There may be some other things now, but at the time that was just about the only thing that this attorney would take to federal court because they knew it would stick. And it has in the Hardwick case and several others. It's warrantless removal of your children. And that's a violation of your constitutional right. And that's why I was able to get in.
And the agency accepts federal funding, and that's why the federal courts can review it. But anything else other than that, it was like what? But what I did do is I set precedent in Texas of being recognized as a parent pro se, and that I do have constitutional rights. So that was pretty huge because even then they were like, she doesn't have any right. I'm like, I do, and I can represent myself pro se. It's okay. I went up against 25 attorneys, and it was so funny. Which bringing in the course of being a woman in Black, I say that it was funny because it was like shock, and some of the things that were actually said to me are even written was amazing because it referenced, which that's really why I realized the connection with, there's two family courts, there's two differences. And so in one of the responses of my cases, they basically were like, they don't have any rights, and then they referenced me as a Black woman. I wasn't recognized when the establishment of family court in Texas, I was considered cattle, if we go back to the origins of it. And so it was a shocking thing, but it was like, okay, so this is where it's at. So anyway, my case went back down to, Texas family courts. But in this, I sued judges. And when I sued judges, they came after me, right? Not only did I sue them once, I sued them twice. But it was so bad to the point to where they just trumped up stuff. So I have a federal case. At the same time, the same judge that I sued against is the same judge that is over my family court case. I wasn't allowed to see, speak, talk to my children for over 2 years. No reason. They don't have to give a reason. There's nothing that has to be done at all. I was not allowed to have a Black attorney. I had to maintain a white attorney. A Black attorney was not recognized. A Black attorney was thrown out of the courtroom. So I had to get, and I made sure that I had a lily white attorney that they would hear and that they would accept. And while I'm going through all of this, I'm going through Pepperdine law. And this is when I found out about, so for me, mediation, I was like, this was stronger than mediation, or dispute resolution was stronger than family court state systems. So I dove into the study of that. And I was like, I have to mediate my case out of this court because I'll never get justice within it. So I come from a framework of, I gotta get out. And if I get out, then I can stick with this ADR, alternative dispute resolution, which is federally protected. So if I can get a mediated agreement, if I need to enforce it, I can go to federal court and have it enforced because it's federally protected. And so what ended up happening is I did mediate myself into visits, supervised. I have no history whatsoever, but it was amazing. Their claim was they thought that I would possibly kidnap the kids, which was crazy since he lived less than 10 miles away from me. Anyway, through that mediated agreement, that's when they weren't monitoring him at all. So my children were going through a whole lot. What ended up happening is I ended up getting full custody of my children through mediation. My daughter ended up having, police found him on top of her. She was fighting for her life, bloody and bruised. They didn't take him to jail. They took her to jail. They put her in a mental hospital, claiming she was manic. Now, I was smart enough that I knew the system well enough. I got the body cameras of the police officers, and we could hear, because they blurred it all out, but we could hear how bruised she was found in his closet, him on top of her. His story and her story didn't make sense, but her story made sense that she was fighting him off. It was a blessing. The only reason why I was able to move so quickly is the mental hospital had a room full of Black practitioners who saw something was wrong. The police had refused to give any parent information, and they were able to just ask my daughter, you know, what is your parents' name and number? And she gave them my number. And I was able, and they made CPS reports, but I was able to take her and rush her to the hospital. And she had all kinds of bruises and different things like that. But the courts, it didn't even matter. I saw that the judge was going to just sweep it underneath the rug. And that's when I told my attorney, hey, let's mediate this out right now. And she was like, no. I'm like, no. Mediate it out. Because I knew. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but let me ask you, we are listening to your story and it sounds as if the system is almost as coercively controlling, if not more coercively controlling than the actual abuser. And I want to go to Latia because your intersection with the court has transitioned from family court to child dependency. And I think that dynamic should be explained because it's not just the family court, it can be an intersection of all of the components with the legal system, whether it's the family court, child welfare, the police, that will come down on women and our Black children in ways that we don't often see with white families.
Yeah, I saw connected to, cover up with, to help each other out. It's just like, the police, they say they have this, what is this, blue wall, blue shield to cover up what they're doing. It's the same thing. So our case was transferred over to the children's court, dependency court, and just dragged out over there for 2 years. And it didn't even have enough weight to stay in that court for 2 years. It was actually against the father initially because of medical neglect, because he kept canceling appointments for my son. But it ended up flipping against me because they erased some things off of my son's medical record and just switched it against me, and then had some other custody evaluator come into the picture and kind of half do a custody evaluation and try to use my military post-traumatic stress disorder against me to try to say it had something to do with Munchausen by proxy, for my son's allergy, like PTSD had something to do with me imagining my child's allergies, which my son's allergies have been documented in his medical record since he was 1 year old. And to try to make the connection with the two is ridiculous. But that dragged out for 2 years, and then now it's back over into the family court. But all the while there's still no criminal charges, nothing, just kind of dragging things out and trying to shift the blame to the victims and trying to ignore what's really going on with the child.
All of you guys, with the exception of Tiffany, I believe, have older children. And I know for Dr. Susan, 2 of her children have now aged out. Elizabeth, I believe your children are closing in on aging out of the system. And Latia, your son is also a teenager now. What have been your experiences? Because we often hear that within the system, children are allowed to speak once they reach a certain age. How has that worked out for any of you?
Well, my son, I know you've seen my son, he's just as tall as me. He's not a teenager yet. He looks like it, but he's just 12. So I think once they reach 14, they're supposed to be able to voice what they want. However, I have some other women that I work with whose children have reached that age and they're not paying that any attention. So it's like they do what they want to do. They still leave the children with the abusers. That's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and I can speak to that also. My son actually kind of ran away to come back to live with me when he was 17. But, he was with me until he was about 13. So even though he'd only been away for 4 years, he still had, he remembered what it's like to be with his mother. He knew he missed it. And he was also kind of had no choice, because at that point, my ex was trying to get him arrested for intimidation just to keep him quiet about disclosing what was going on at his place. So he heard him say to the police that he wanted my son to be arrested and not to get probation or not to get any kind of rehabilitation, because he just wanted him in jail. And it's like, at that point, my son knew like he had to run away and get home or else. So his position, just to get back to your question, he was ready to fight the system, do whatever he can, report what was going on for his younger siblings and so on and so forth. So he still had his sort of mental sanity, although it wasn't appreciated. They still didn't hear him even after he left. And my ex tried to discredit him, but he still had a good understanding of what was wrong, how he was wronged, and what he could do for his siblings. Whereas my daughters, who's aging out, she has been gone for, on the other hand, for 7 years. And it's almost as if they're in like a cult, depending on how harsh they could be as far as, separating you like this random or things that are these false narratives that they've been told to make them feel good about being away from their mother, they still reign. And so even though my daughter can come home and she has made efforts to do it, it's not like she would have done, 7 years ago when she was initially taken. And in some cases, it's very sad to say, but even when they can come home, they don't, because they've been adopted or indoctrinated into this other philosophy that their mother is a bad person or abusive, even though they can't really cite what it is. So the sooner the children get home, the better and easier it is for them to make a difference once they get there.
Elizabeth?
Similar, but so when I was able to, when my daughter made outcries from the time that I wasn't allowed to see them, they would put my daughter in mental hospital until she would agree to go home with dad. So, so I was able, in getting full custody, to mediate to get full custody of her. My son still wanted a relationship with dad. It's just a father-son thing. And I didn't want to go through that fight just due to all that she had been through. Now, my son had been abused also, but he'll be 17 this year. And so what I did do is I got him 5 days, and his dad has him too. So that's how I was able to mediate that out. But it's still he struggles, but the big thing that I did was I made sure to keep receipts of things. So anytime that he makes a claim or he says, well, Mom, that's what you did. And I'll be like, well, here's a book. If you ever want to read it, you can. You're old enough to. And if you ever want to know the truth, it's there for you. But I'm not, I try not to go through that whole back and forth, because I don't have the energy or the capacity to deal with that. But what I do is he knows I have receipts. So there are times where he'll be like, Mom, Dad said this happened in this year. And I'm like, well, there's the book over there. You can look in the year and see what happened. And so I think that has helped, but it's been a lot. And you're hoping that they don't take on a whole lot of characteristics, of the abusers.
You all have been willing to be very outspoken about your cases. Many women really live in fear that by sharing anything about their story, it will cause them to lose custody. And so I want to spend these last few minutes, the last 10 minutes before we do the Q&A, talking about what do you believe should be done to rectify, because I'm a complete abolitionist. I believe the whole system needs to be torn down and rethought. I don't think it works. I think, and I've been saying for years, this is not a system that's broken. This is how it was designed. And people don't understand that family courts were initiated around policing Black families. And Child Protective Services, which is a benevolent title, Child Welfare, Child Protective Services, Department of Children, could be nothing further from the truth. That system has come to be known as the family policing system by Dr. Dorothy Roberts, who has studied child welfare for 30 years. She's a law professor out of the University of Pennsylvania. And she says that the transition in child welfare from the 50s to the 60s, when they were only addressing white families and white children within the home, once they transitioned through the 60s, it became about Black families and removing children from the home and basically commodifying or monetizing the trauma. So my thought is we can't look at reforming these systems. There have been dozens and dozens of reforms throughout the country. We need to rethink how these systems are done and abolish them. What are your thoughts about how we can address the system and really start protecting children from the same personalities that tend to present themselves in these types of cases?
Well, I would like to go far, as far as veterans, I feel like they need to be heard in a separate system. I think, because veterans and military fall under this federal bubble. They already have a veterans court set up, and I think that needs to be expanded upon or something set up for the families with no criminal charges. I think that would be handled better with the military system, because they understand that culture better than what's going on in this civilian court. But that's how I think that the veteran and military population should be handled. It should be completely separated out of there. And then I'm sure the other ladies have some other ideas of what to do with the rest of it.
Yeah, this goes right into my book and what my book is about, because essentially my book, it's called Black American Refugee, Escaping the Narcissism of the American Dream. And the goal of my book was to educate people about systemic racism and systemic abuse, and how that looks a lot like narcissistic abuse and abusive and coercive relationships. And by the end of the book, I answer very clearly the question of, well, what's next? With regards to overcoming any type of oppression and inequality, there has to be a drastic shift in resources. And people don't like to think about the fact that the family court is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and that's going into the pockets of primarily white people, white male judges, white folks who run who do these custody evaluations, you name it, white therapists, these reunification camps. And so when we start to uncover the hideousness of family court, you see this interconnectedness with the failures of capitalism, and ultimately the oppressiveness of systemic capitalism, and how that has always preyed on our hurt. So I think that the answer of what do we do with the family court in terms of reform is the same answer for how we addressed all inequality, whether it be racist inequality, whether it be sexist inequality. And that goes back to what you were saying about abolition. We need to rethink and restructure entirely the systems with a big focus on the redistribution of the resources and the wealth. Because if we can't afford to advocate for ourselves within a system, how could that system ever bring us justice? It cannot.
Elizabeth?
So good job, Tiffany and Latia. I definitely, so I have long-term and short-term goals with this. One, definitely discussions like we're having, but authentic discussions, and not just discussions about you. As mothers, and you're going through this, you're going to go through hurt and pain and suffering, right? But there has to be a support system and clarity that we have to give one another. And one of the main things that we have to do is we have to come after these judges. We have to start changing the discussion and the topics of their platforms and what they're running underneath. And one of the main reasons why I became an ombudsman is to start collecting this data and be able to identify, okay, what judge, because you can, from the data, you can identify what judge is biased. You can identify what county agenda of the county is happening. These judges all come together and they push certain things. So in one county, when once I became underneath supervised visits, I was like, oh, so there's a bunch of mothers that are similar in my situation. I began collecting cases. So if I go through their case file and I'm looking at their cases, none of them, there was no determination on the reason why they have supervised visits. It was just a judge, right? We looked over 457 cases and was able to identify that this judge did not like Black women. This judge also did not like women who had more than 2 children. You were able to see patterns, you were able to see things, but the only reason why we're able to collect that information was getting in positions to be able to obtain. Now, they blocked me out of some stuff, and yes, they threw me in jail for some certain things because
Yes.
of the advocacy. But that should be expected if I'm ruffling feathers in an area or in, it's to be expected. And I think that's the issue with our movement, especially within this family court movement. No, everyone is going through so much trauma, because it's trauma to have your child taken. It's trauma to sit up there and hear, you carried your children, you love your children, and for someone to come at you when you kept them alive this long and tell you, oh, you're horrible. What? So we have to have more, organization. I think we're kind of disorganized. We have to have more organization of support. So what I was able to do, I would go to court before they would throw me out. I would go to court and I would identify and look and see, hey, okay, so this mother here is going through this, not just court watch, but I call it court movement. And then I'll be like, okay, this judge is just corrupt. Well, let's get them out the seat and stick with it. And even with my children aging out, I'm about this fight. I can't, just because my children, or I have my children back, I have to continue to be involved in this, because if this doesn't stop, it's just like with Black families. It's this behavior, this treatment started with Blackness, right? And it has infiltrated into white and people of color circles. It hasn't stopped. So what that lets me know, it's only going to grow. Evil grows. So I have to stop this now, because I cannot have my grandchildren go through this if they have to. I cannot have my sister's children go through this. This has to stop. So we have to really be honest and take up the fight. And even you can cry at night, but let's just go ahead and put on our heels and put on our shoes, whatever float your boat. And then let's really come together and get to work. And we have to attack the judges.
In the last couple of minutes, I want to have Susan comment about her thoughts.
Well, I'm all for tearing it all down too and starting fresh too. I got to tell you that. But I think, when it comes to building back up a child services that can really make a difference, if we could follow a model similar to what Elizabeth was explaining when her daughter had a hard time, and the police weren't believing, child service weren't believing, but she went to the doctors and they were like, no, this is not what happened. And so there was a time when you go out for child services, it wasn't just a social worker. Like in my case, I reported the social worker that went out because she wasn't protecting my children, and I tried to report her to the behavioral science board, and they were like, she's not licensed with the behavioral science board. She wasn't a psychologist. She wasn't a child social worker. She's just someone who, was coming and assessing my situation and was doing it wrong. I know it was corrupt. I did find out later she was dating my ex. So I'm sure there was a secondary, but the point is, if there were some professionals really assessing it, whether it be psychologists, there used to be nurses that went along with it, then I think you'd have a better understanding of what really is the child service, how you can really help the children, and not just having these random social workers that aren't trained at all going out. I think adding a medical component would be helpful. In addition to that, contacting the women's legal services, female attorneys, in law, that can help us move back to women having more power in the family court. I would advocate bringing back the tender year doctrine, because at least in all of our situations that are here today, that are obviously good mothers, and it is, sexually discriminating, because you say they'll be in the best care if they're with their mother. And in this case, all of these cases, it would be true. And I think it's probably the case in 99% of the time. So I think the tender year doctrine would help circumvent so many of these errors It wouldn't even give it to the judge to make the mistake. It wouldn't give it to the social worker to make the mistake. It would just preemptively stop that, and you're with your mom and you can move on to other things. And I think we could argue that it is the child's best interest and sort of move back to that, because when women lost that, we really lost our power.
I agree.
Mhm.
I want to get to our Q&A because we have a couple of questions. Some of them overlap, but one particular point that keeps coming up is the data. Many of our panelists, our participants are wondering, is there any data about the demographic makeup of litigants within the family court? And I can say that I have not seen anything because of the lack of transparency. And I think that's very deliberate. But do any of you have any knowledge about data that can be mined for the purpose of addressing some of the issues that we've spoken about?
So now of recent, I can tell you within the last 3 years, there has been a move due to the complaints that have occurred within family court. There has been a move to collect more statistical statistics within family court. They weren't even collecting anything, right? And they're actually very shocking. The reason why they don't want it to come out is because technically in family court, closer to 90% of people are actually self-representing themselves within family court. Less than I would say 10% are utilizing attorneys. People don't realize that, but the 10% that are utilizing attorneys are the cases that are in what they would call high conflict. Well, what that means is the ones that are using attorneys are the ones that are most likely going through abuse. Or they have high wealth and they're really fighting it out there. So it's those two. So really this demographic is really like supporting the profession of family court attorneys. And so so that all kind of came out, and now they have like pilot programs that are really focused on trying to collect this information, but they're not pushing to collect the information that's needed to identify or have those identifiers of, the different cases of those who lose custody versus those, the different things that we can really dive sink our teeth into. Now, I was able to go through the supervised visits to be able to see that. And those data statistics are shocking. But as far as collectively, similar to what Roman is saying, no. And there is a big fight not to let that happen. And it's optional. But that's another thing that we can definitely advocate for is, hey, really pushing to get the different statistics because they reveal so much. And that's the important piece. But if we actually start and we don't even have to go through, because they try to really block, it's supposed to be in most states, public records. They try to really block the cases also. And court clerks don't want it to happen. If they see it happening, that you're actually diving in and you're collecting data and you're collecting information, they actually will block it, or they'll try to shut it down, or they'll shut your access, or different things like that occur. But I feel like this should be in the forefront, because if we do this, there was one, so I did this in Texas, Brazos County, Tarrant County also, until they came after me. But Brazos County, we were able to identify basically the judge who, and they eventually got that judge removed, but the judge who would just sentence all mothers to, it was a judge and an attorney, and they were really close, and whatever was put in front of that judge, the mother would have supervised visits, children removed, didn't matter the history, didn't matter, what transpired. So it's, to me, that's key, because if we're able to get this data, and Joan Muir for Joan to be able to obtain and get the appeals. Appeals is such a fallacy in family. It's not even real, especially for Black mothers. It's not even real, but to see or have those statistics or be able to pull that was huge. And Joan got a lot of pushback on the, even now, like the Judicial Council meetings, they'll try to just, you know, sway that away because they don't want that information out there. So definitely we need to push it.
There's a question about resources specifically for African-American mothers. I wanted to address that because there are organizations like the Genesee Center, our sponsor here, who have a robust legal advocacy program, but they are limited in what they can do because of the nature of family court. There's UJIMA, which is a policy, a Black women's, Black domestic violence survivors policy center out of Washington, DC. But again, they're about policy nationwide. They're not specifically targeting or working at the ground level. So I wanted to ask if any of you know of any resources that, you know, the people who are watching can access.
So on my end, because of the complexity of my case involving a convention, I kind of stumbled upon different organizations that have reached out to help me out. One is called Hans Siegel, and essentially they take on kind of complex custody cases. It's a foundation. Also, Global Arc, they deal with what they like Hague Convention, women who've been Hagued essentially, and offer a bunch of like legal services and also just support. And I think that ultimately kind of ending that isolation, because isolation is one of the key parts of how an abuser controls victims. They want to isolate you from your friends. They want to isolate you from your support systems. And for me, a big part of kind of empowering myself and kind of taking back control over my case has really come from closing that gap. So oftentimes mothers are isolated in these traumatic experiences that they have, and they don't realize, wait a minute, it's not me. This is actually a widespread issue. And so the more we kind of connect with one another and reach out to each other, the more powerful we become. And, you know, I was saying it before, like there's so much power in numbers and we underestimate. Firstly, so many of us are so dope. I just want to say, like, it's such an honor to be able to share this space with all of these incredible women. And it doesn't matter how they try to tear us down. The truth is we can be torn down because as a collective, like if we like pile on top of each other's shoulders, it's insane. So ultimately that's where it is right now. Like once we connect with one another and we advocate together, and that's where we're going to find our power.
Thank you, Tiffany. Resources are limited, which is one of the reasons why I did start I Am Pro Se. We actually won't be up in full capacity until the beginning of the year. But as far as there's just a limit. We have from the Black survivors perspective, you know, we have a lot of agencies that have statistical information, but as far as there is a difference, if we're transparent, of what's actually happening in servicing Black survivors, even within predominantly led white agencies. And so it's just a cultural disconnect that exists. And the cultural disconnect, you know, I have many a times I would have, you know, I'm talking to someone on, you know, and they're saying, hey, okay, we're just, you know, you just need to move, or you needed it. I'm like, I can't move. Like, I don't have that, you know, and then they're like, oh, okay, we can give you this and we can give you that. But the assumption would be, I would have that in my bank account. I don't have that in my bank account. My family at the time did not have that resource to put my family at risk. Me going there, you know, what if something happens to my family, because this is what my ex does. So it was very limited in understanding culturally movement, what that looks like. And then even they're like, oh, you know, you're scared. You're like, okay, what all resources can I do? Oh, call the police. Okay. The police is going to take me in, you know, like, no, I can't call the police because most likely like these are the issues that we're going through. Or even going to court. Like I always would prepare going to court with the expectation of possibly they may put me in jail, because today I'm going to let them know how I feel. So what resources do you have if they do put me in there? What resources are there? A lot of the bail movement, our bail funds are not for situations in dealing with family court. A lot of the bail stuff is not for that. So I had to create my own, which is the reason why I did create I Am Pro Se. And this is the reason why we do, especially Black survivors, we really have to come together because we understand it from that perspective. But then also our white counterparts or those other people of color to also have more of an understanding and embrace culture and support and understanding the movements of different cultures, and not try to think that it all looks like this. So, but it is very limited, but I feel like there is a movement or initiative to get better insight on the resources that should be provided. To me, every Black survivor should have some type of ring, something on the out, because most likely we can't move. Most likely we don't economically, it's not there. So we have to have, there should be a connection with community. There should be connection. There are things that we need to do. So it is limited, but I believe there's an initiative. It's just other agencies opening up to know. And definitely within our military and our veterans, that's a whole different beast with that, but it's similar, like, because it's a different culture, but they need that support also.
Well, we're down to our last couple of minutes, so I just want to close it out. I want to thank all of you. You have been magnificent. I know most of you. I am just meeting Tiffany Drayton. I'm so inspired because Tiffany put it all out there. She burned up Twitter with her story, and I just love our ability to stand up for ourselves, because if we don't stand for ourselves, who will? Oftentimes we don't even have the men in our community standing with us in the same way that maybe in other communities we see it. So I just want to give kudos to all of you, because all of you are such brave, courageous women, willing to share your stories, willing to call out the system and the institutional betrayal for what it is. You women have done the work. You have researched, you have read, you have learned, you have taken it upon yourself, because we know as Black mothers what it means to take care of our children and to prioritize our families. And so I just want to honor you and show my gratitude for you being willing to come together in this platform. And again, thanking Family Court Awareness Month for allowing us to have this conversation, because that's the only way we can create the awareness, is by having these conversations and helping people get educated. So I am so thankful. And I just want to say thank you for sharing your stories. I hope to continue having these conversations. I will always call on all of you anytime I am called to do work like this. So for everyone who joined us, thank you for showing up. And if you have any questions, please contact Sandy at familycourtawarenessmonth.org. All right, everyone, have a great rest of your evening. Thank you so much for joining us.